All the time we hear discussion about rights, specifically human rights. People talk about what are we owed by virtue of being alive. But on the flip side, it's much less frequent that we hear conversation about what are our responsibilities. And so today we're going to talk not about what we are owed by virtue of being alive, but what we owe by virtue of being alive. Welcome to Collective Conscious, episode 12 out of infinity, where my friend Junwei and I talk about topics in philosophy, psychology, and politics as they relate to the human condition. How are you doing today, Junwei?
Doing pretty well, surviving.
Yeah, I guess that's what we're all trying to do. All right, so normally I just let you start off with some initial thoughts, but I actually want to say a couple of things before we jump straight into this conversation. I want to make a distinction between two sort of classes of responsibility that I am sort of splitting up in my head. So the first one would be sort of similar to the episode that we did about human rights, and what I would call these are the more objective responsibilities. And what I mean by that are the sorts of responsibilities that I would consider humans have in the same way that they have human rights. So something like the right to life, what does that translate to? It would translate to some sort of responsibility, essentially not to kill other people, really. The other type of responsibility, which is actually what I find more interesting, are what I'm just going to call subjective responsibilities. And by that, what I really mean is responsibilities that, in my opinion, people have, but are not necessarily, intrinsic to human nature or necessary by virtue of us being alive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I thought of is like, the ones that are not intrinsic is like have like a duty or responsibility to your family. Like there's no like law that says like if you don't take care of your family, well, actually like negligence is a thing, but like, if you're an adult and you don't take care of your family, there's not like a law that says like you're gonna go to jail for not taking care of your family. Whereas like killing another person, like there's a law that says that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's another decent distinction. So now I'll do what I normally do in the beginning, which is just bump it over to you real quick on your initial thoughts. So what are you thinking?
Okay, so my initial framework on this question, which is the question is what is our duty or responsibility in life? And first I want to say like this question is a lot more sensible and important than asking like what is my passion or what is the meaning of life? Like people think like all three of those questions are interchangeable, but I think that asking what your duty is just a lot more practical and relevant. Um, and so yeah, I think asking yourself what your duty is just covers a lot more ground. And the first distinction is that like I think passion is often self-serving while duty is other-serving. When we only care about our passions, we only focus on like what we really love and enjoy, and we only focus on what makes us feel good. But in the process, we may end up trying to avoid things that don't immediately give us that spark of joy or motivation. So for me, what comes to my mind when I ask myself what's my duty, it's usually a duty that's like outside of myself. It's something outwards. It's something towards other people outside of myself. Um, and so a duty often implies like serving something outside of yourself with that, whether that's a person, a community, an ideal, or even like even God, right? That could be a duty. And I think why having a duty is so important is that it can often add like a real source of meaning to your life, even if it isn't necessarily a source of immediate pleasure, which I think is a big distinction.
So you would say that the nature of responsibility is sort of intrinsically outward looking.
I think most of it is, yeah.
That's pretty interesting. So I assume that when you're talking about this, you would be talking more on the end of the subjective responsibilities from the way that I laid it out earlier, right?
Definitely.
Nice. Okay, cool. Yeah, like I said before, I think that the discussion about subjective responsibilities is probably more interesting than that of objective responsibilities. But I do want to touch real quickly on objective responsibilities because I don't think it'll take as long, and then we can really dive into the subjective side of things. And
Sure. Yeah.
so I'll lay out what my thoughts are on this really quickly, and then you can do the same. But for me, and I actually kind of said this already, but what I see as what I would call objective responsibilities are really just the other ends of what I would call human rights. It's those things that we maintain for both ourselves and each other just by virtue of being alive. And so for those who haven't listened to the human rights episode, one of the things I said was I essentially try to break down human rights into a few basic categories. And those three categories ended up being life, speech, and I think the phrase that I used was labor. But what I essentially mean by that is the right to your own like productive capacity. And so what would be the flip side of those? Well, it's pretty simple. For life, I already said what it is. I mean, basically don't kill people except in self-defense. And the reason that killing in self-defense would be okay is because technically your right would have been violated first, or was, attempting to have been violated first. So that one's pretty simple though. Speech, I guess you could say it's also pretty simple. What it really comes down to is, not taping people's mouths shut, both figuratively and literally. And then the last one is, I think, in the essence of responsibility, what that really would boil down to is theft and not being able to steal from other people. That's how I would define it. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts? If any, I would say it's perfectly valid to say that there is no such thing as an objective responsibility. Just because we're alive doesn't mean we have to do anything or not do anything. So what are your thoughts about that part?
I haven't really thought about the objective part while researching for this episode. Actually, I was more thinking of like all the the opposite realm of that. So I couldn't give you a
That's
clear
fine,
answer on
man. You
that.
can just tell me you agree with me.
I agree with you, man.
All right, that's all I wanted to hear anyways. I mean, we could pretty much just end the episode. All of these episodes are me basically just trying to fish you into agreeing with everything I say. I don't know if you realize that yet.
Damn, the bait, dude.
Yeah, this is all an elaborate ruse. I'm not even posting these online. These are just for my own satisfaction.
I got the
All right.
tapes ready. Yeah.
All right, so let's go back into the subjective side then. I'm happy we could spend more time on this one. And so you mentioned family. Would you say that that's probably the largest source of responsibility?
I think generally speaking, and for most people, I think family is pretty up there, if not number one. I think there's a lot of cases, like there's always going to be exceptions where like, if you're some extreme cases where if you're like abused by your family early on and like, in those cases you might not have such a responsibility to them, but I'm using really general terms here. So like generally speaking, I think that most people have a duty to their family.
Yeah. So if you don't have a super in-depth answer to this, that's all right. But what sorts of things would you say we have a duty to, I suppose you could say, provide for our family? Like, is it, the bare minimum, like just making sure that they don't die, or does it go beyond that? Like, where do you see that line?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, for me personally, I think you have a as a son, I have a duty to my parents to make sure I take care of them in old age whenever they get to that stage. I think if I ever become a parent, I have a duty to my son or daughter, like to raise them at least to an adult and provide them necessarily with whatever that means. And whatever that means, that's subjective for each person. So I don't really have like a true line for that. What do you think about that?
Let's see. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I actually see, so I see a fundamental difference between responsibility to parents and responsibility to children. And the reason for that is that I think it seems like we conceptualize this sort of subjective aspects of responsibility a little differently. As you said earlier, you see it primarily as a outward-looking thing, but I think I see it primarily, or at least firstly, as an inward-looking thing, and then secondarily from that becoming an outward-looking thing. And then I guess on a tertiary level, it would be more of a societal level thing, whereas like it would extend beyond just the people you know. But the reason I see it primarily as an inward-looking thing is because, and this is just my own life, but I really view my primary responsibilities as being to myself. Like, I guess you could say that it's a responsibility not to let myself down in some ways, to fulfill things that I feel like I should, or things I feel like I'm able to. And the reason I think that creates a distinction between responsibility to parents and responsibility to children is because children are an extension in some ways of yourself. You have created your children. That is a choice. All things considered, it's basically a choice that you've made in most cases. And so I would say that the responsibility for yourself actually does extend to your children before it even reaches that secondary level. And where I would say that that responsibility extends to more specifically is in ensuring that they can grow up to become responsible for themselves. So that's kind of how I see it at a high level.
So you think that so let me get this straight. Like your first responsibility in life is to yourself, and then but if you choose to have children, which is as you said a deliberative conscious choice, then that you couldn't have that. I don't want to use the word burden, but you have that now. You have another duty to them.
Yeah, I mean, burden has a negative connotation, but strictly denotatively, I think it's an accurate word to use. Um, like I said, it's a choice that in some sense you've made. And I believe that everybody is responsible to the consequences of their own actions. And if the consequence is a child, then I do believe that you have a responsibility to basically put that kid in a position where they can be independent or they can be responsible for themselves, where they no longer need you, no longer need anyone really. I think that's really what the responsibility is with regards to family at the highest level.
Okay, so I guess we can say that we can both agree that if you have children, if you put them in a place to succeed and be independent is basically the bottom line there.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think after that would come the responsibility to something like parents or siblings, because they're not in the same way as children are an extension of yourself. They're not any sort of product of a conscious choice you've made. However, and I would say that this is where it becomes even more subjective, in my opinion, you still do have some responsibilities to your family in the sense that it's sort of a mutually beneficial social system, just like a friendship is. But I wouldn't say that you have a responsibility to your friends in the same way that have a responsibility to your children. And I think it's analogous for parents and siblings.
Yeah, and I want to bring up this point, which is like there's a really interesting distinction between the Eastern views of duty to your parents and also like to your parents and kids, and there's a different Western view on this, right? So in the West, like it might just be a stereotype. You can correct me on this, but like it seems like when kids grow up, they kind of get kicked out of the house in a way and be like, okay, you're on your own now. I mean, you can come to us if you need help, but you're pretty much on your own. Whereas in the East, it's kind of like, okay, we provided for you, and now there needs to be some reciprocal things here, right? Do you know that distinction I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's way more common in Eastern culture for like multiple generations to live together, for example, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So would you say that you have like a subjective preference between one of those systems or the other? I mean, if from what you said, if I had to guess, it would seem like you would prefer the Eastern methodology or philosophy.
Uh, I don't know if I would really prefer it. I don't think I have a true opinion of that at this point. I think that's just something I personally grew up with in that kind of culture, so that's kind of what I know. But I know for someone like you grew up in the opposite kind of, right? So, what are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
it's an important distinction for sure because I mean, of course, we've talked about this just in our own conversations, but where you come from shapes a lot of how you see things. Like two people could look at the same thing and see radically different, um, interpret it radically differently because of everything in their lives that have led up to that point. So, yeah, it's actually a great point to keep in mind while I try to figure out what my opinions of responsibility really are. But even thinking about it, I think that that sort of reciprocal nature of the Eastern philosophy of responsibility to your parents, it definitely makes sense. And sort of like I said before, it's in some ways like a friendship. And I would still classify it in the same, maybe like a very, very strong friendship, but on the level of the responsibilities themselves, more similar to a friendship than for offspring.
Yeah, and I also don't necessarily think like either view is wrong, honestly. Like they can both work out in their own ways. It's just a matter of how you view them, right? So I think, the Eastern view, if you have to grow up and also take care of your parents or just do something in that kind of nature, I don't think that's necessarily bad. And then also, at the same time, I don't think the Western view of growing up and becoming fully independent, I don't think that's bad either. I think it's just a matter of how you grew up and what you want to associate yourself with.
Yeah, I think they can both be implemented in healthy and unhealthy ways. It's not the philosophy itself that determines the effectiveness. I think it's more on the people who are implementing it that determine how effective it's going to be or how healthy it's going to be.
Yeah, seems
That's
that
probably
way.
true of most philosophies, though.
So do you think
Yeah.
now that we covered family to a good extent, do we have any other duties in your opinion?
Well, I'm going to go back to the responsibility to yourself, and I'm just going to explain the way that I see it. And this is something that I'm not saying that everybody should view it the same way. I just want to kind of share how I think about it. And when I think about my responsibility to myself, primarily what I think of is the phrase fulfilling my potential. And of course, potential is this very abstract thing. It's kind of hard to even define, really. But I think it's something that I have a clear idea of for myself in my head. And quite frankly, I would feel disappointed in myself for not at least putting significant effort into attaining what I subjectively feel like I'm able to attain. And in that sense, I do feel like I have a responsibility to myself. Another way that I feel like I have a responsibility to myself, and this one I would more strongly say that I would suggest for other people, is more in the matter of taking responsibility for yourself, taking responsibility for the actions that you do and the consequences of those actions, whether they're, expected or unexpected, whether they're, just or unjust in your eyes. Taking responsibility for your actions is very important.
Yeah, I gotta say you present a very compelling argument because originally I said that you asked me what is the first duty we have. I said like I said generally speaking family, but actually I might shift my tone a bit based on what you just said because I think that before even family, you actually have a duty to yourself first. And I want to give like a kind of a real life example, which is like during like a plane, and when the masks drop, the flight attendants tell you to put your mask first before anyone else's. And like, why is that? It's just because you can't help anyone else before you help yourself, right? So that's kind of like a, like a kind of a specific example, but I think that can apply to this general concept of you have a duty to yourself first, and then you have a duty to other people. Because if you can't take care of yourself, if your physical and mental health are like out of whack, like you can't take care of other people, right? So I think going back on what I said, I think you do have a duty to yourself, like make sure you're okay first, and then you put other people second in that kind of way.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really, really smart way of putting it too. Like that's a perfect analogy. If you believe that your primary responsibility is to other people, all right, fine. But you're not even going to be able to fulfill that responsibility unless you are like okay yourself, taking care of yourself, healthy for yourself. And in that sense, it would be analogous to putting your own mask on. If you're not putting your own mask on first, you're not going to be able to help anyone.
Absolutely. But one thing I want to bring up is like, even though in generally speaking, we just agreed that like you have a duty to yourself, making sure yourself is okay before anything else. I think there are some cases to be considered where like you actually don't put yourself first. So one common example would be like if you're a parent and your child is like, I don't know, they need like their life is threatened because they need like a kidney transplant, right? And they won't be able to survive without that transplant. And you would like, I think most parents, I mean, I'm not a parent so I can't say for myself, but I would suggest that most parents would easily say like, okay, I'm gonna give up my life for my son or daughter, and that would be it, like no questions asked, I think, for most parents. So all that said, there's like some cases where like you do make this big grandiose sacrifice because like that is your duty as a parent. So like if you need to sacrifice your life for your child, you do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that raises the question of whether morality is responsibility. You know what I mean? Like, are your moral beliefs your responsibilities in some sense? Like, do you have to follow through with those, or can they be independent of each other? Because I would say a parent, giving their life for their child is fundamentally it's a moral action, is it not?
It's a moral action is also I would wager to say like evolutionary based too.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And we talked in another episode about the origins of those different senses of morality. So I don't want to start going into a complete repetition of that episode, but yeah, you've got me thinking now. Maybe morality and responsibility really are intrinsically linked to each other, and perhaps that's what links rights to responsibilities fundamentally is morality. Like that's the chain that keeps them together.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think another idea with this concept of duty and responsibility is like, what is really the point of having a duty and responsibility? Like, what's like the silver lining behind it besides like actually fulfilling your duty? And I think that like, there's this Sanskrit word called Dharma, which means duty and responsibility, and they kind of have this connotation where like, if you have a Dharma in life, a duty in life, you actually can like endure the suffering that's inevitably faced in life. So, going back to our episode on suffering, Buddha said humans are entitled to two things in life: suffering and death. It's a fairly grim outlook, but it actually turns out to be true, in my personal opinion. So like the way to live life according to him would be like not to avoid suffering, but to live in accordance with your dharma or your duty. And it's why we see people like Gandhi or MLK or even like Hitler on the other side of the extreme. Like, so why do I bring up Hitler, right? Like, did he have a duty? I think he did have a duty for himself, even though it wasn't the right duty. Like, how was he able to transform Germany, which was like the bottom tier country, and then just made it like a complete powerhouse, right? So like, I think he also had a dharma, even though it might not be the right one. But my point is like having a duty responsibility also allows you to endure the suffering that is needed in life, and things like doctors, how they're able to sit on call for 24 hours, like that's because they have a duty to their patients, and that's how they're able to tolerate the suffering.
For sure, for sure. And implementing some sort of meaning into your suffering, I think, is the most effective mechanism of overcoming suffering, or at least willingly enduring it. But there has to be that meaning. So let me ask you, in your personal life, what would you say your dharma is? I don't even know if that's a grammatically correct way of asking the question, but like, how would you describe your dharma personally then?
So I mean that is the right way to put it, and I think Dharma is usually classified in the kind of the Eastern sense, where the first 25 to 30 years of your life is actually just like you have a Dharma just to yourself, as kind of similar to what we touched on earlier, that we have a duty to ourselves first. So
Mhm.
the first 30 years of your life is kind of discovering yourself, like what your potential is, what you're good at in life, what you're bad at in life. And once you have that kind of knowledge, that kind of self-awareness, the next stage in life would be like a duty to like a family, or if you a family or kids. And even if with people who don't have family, maybe you have a duty to your friends, or a community you're involved in. So I think my answer would be like your dharma could be also classified in like stages in life too.
Mhm. Yeah, that sounds actually kind of similar to what I was saying earlier, where I would say the primary level of responsibility is the self. Secondary would be like family and friends, and then tertiary level would be societal. But I don't think you can skip that order. Like you're saying, there's a chronological aspect to it. I don't think you can start on a societal level and then work your way to the self. I just don't think it's possible. You'll inevitably fail because one necessarily builds off of the previous. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're all linked together, but they need to follow a not a super specific chronological sequence, but they have to be somewhat in order.
Yeah. So let me ask the question again to you. Like in your personal life, what would you say your duties are, your dharma? I mean, you don't have to get super personal about it.
Well, I think right now, I think my dharma is to I don't know, to put it simply, to discover more about myself. Like, I'm only 22 as April 6th, 2020. And I think there's just so much to be learned about myself. Like, I can't even I've learned so much about myself in the past like year or so that I can't even fathom how much more I will learn in the next 4 or 5 years, honestly. And it could
Yeah,
differ from every person, like depending on like how much you introspect or how much self-awareness you have. I think those are definitely two big factors that correlate with, how much you can discover about yourself. Awareness precedes control and all that. So that's basically that's my dharma right now, which is, you know, sort of living life as it is, and just finding what I like more meaning and stuff like that.
it's like learning who you are, really.
Pretty much. What do you say your dharma is at this stage of your life?
I touched on it a little bit where I mentioned, fulfilling what I see as my own potential. And of course, I don't think that there's an objective potential, but what I feel is my potential. Um, and I think that that's sort of the first step, though, because what I really mean by fulfilling my potential is, in some sense, transcending to those secondary and tertiary levels of responsibility. It's understanding myself to such a degree that I can effectively help the people around me and effectively make the world around me hopefully better. But, it's like you said before, Hitler, I'm sure, thought he was making the world better. So, you got to be careful at the same time. But yeah, what I would describe my dharma as, I'm using that term properly again, um, is improving myself, both learning about myself and improving myself, making myself what I would consider to be a better person, and working towards creating the optimal version of myself. And something that I've noticed on this sort of journey, because it sounds like really what we're both doing is quite similar I mean, we're both at pretty similar points in our lives, both somewhat recently graduated college, or both in our early 20s, working some of our first real jobs. Um, and I would say that one thing that I've noticed on this stage is that the more I learn about myself, the more I come to have a sense of respect for myself. So I'm curious if you felt that way at all.
Can you elaborate on like what you mean by like a sense of respect?
Yeah, I guess another word for it might be confidence, but it's not exactly confidence. I would say that I've gained a sense of respect for myself in the sense that I have more, maybe appreciation would be a good word. Not in like an egotistical way, but in a, wow, I really could be capable of making things better if I am successful and like if I work hard enough to do so. There was a time in my life where I would say I probably had no hope whatsoever in my ability to affect the world positively or maybe even negatively. But the more I've learned about myself and tried to grow as a person, the more I've had confidence in my own ability to do those things.
Okay, now that you've elaborated, I can actually totally resonate with what you just said. I think that if you discover more about yourself and allow yourself to grow in a healthy way, you can discover so many things about yourself that you had no idea you were capable of, and like you're really full of potential, honestly. And I think just the more you learn about yourself, because I think earlier on for me, it was kind of in a similar vein to you, where I thought that I wasn't really capable of many things. I didn't really treat myself nicely. I beat myself up for the most simple things. But now looking back at these past couple of years, I think I can definitely say that I've grown in a way that I've learned like how much I'm capable of, and how much like I also learned like how much I have left to grow too.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of it too, is the more you learn about yourself, the more you don't know about yourself. Well, it's exactly like they say, the more you know, the less you know. It's just like that with self-discovery as well, I would say. The
It's the
universe is no different from the universe within us.
it's the Dunning-Kruger, but with self-discovery.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. For reference, Dunning-Kruger effect. Do you want to explain it or do you want me to?
You got it.
All right, so the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially I guess phenomenon might be the right word in psychology, where people with lower ability will perceive themselves as having higher ability. I don't know if there is like an official reason for this, but the reason I sort of assumed is that the less you know about something, the less of that entire universe of exploration you're aware of even existing. So you think you've explored a higher percentage of it than really exists. therefore you will perceive your own abilities as greater.
Yeah, essentially. I think a really funny way I heard it put it was like you're too dumb to know that you're dumb.
Yeah. I keep
So,
I don't know about you, but I keep getting these ads on YouTube for these like masterclass things. Have you seen those?
like classes online.
It's like celebrities teaching classes, I think. I don't know. I never clicked on the link, but I get a ton of ads for it.
I have not, but I'm sure it's. I mean, it sounds like the perfect clickbait for our generation.
Yeah. Well, basically, there's one with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and the way that they open the ad, I never even like hear more than 5 seconds of it because I've never bothered actually listening to the full thing. But the way he opens the ad is by saying something like, "It's very difficult to achieve a balance between knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not knowing enough to know that you're wrong." I think that's pretty much explaining the Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, that's simply put, I think so.
Yeah. So, do you have any more main thoughts, or do you want to wrap this up into some key takeaways?
I think just one more thought I had is I wanted to discuss like how do you even find like your at this first stage of your Dharma, like from 0 to 30 years old, like how do you even find like how do you find yourself really? How do you find like what you're interested in? And I think one thing that, and also I would like to hear your thoughts on this, but I think one thing that could be helpful that I learned from someone is like take a piece of paper and write a page on what's wrong with the world. And you're gonna have a lot of thoughts that come out, and you're gonna have a lot of random this and that. But I think if you really sit down and write this page on what's wrong with the world, you can actually discover a lot of things. And for me personally, like I didn't realize how much like I cared about mental health, and not even for like my own self, but like just to like psychologically speaking, like I think that's a really interesting subject. And like therapy, I think is super interesting. So I think if you practice this exercise, you can actually discover a lot of things that you didn't know about yourself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The funny thing is that when you say that, my first thought goes to people in all likelihood projecting those things that they probably see in themselves onto what they see as the problems in the world. What do you think about that?
I never really took it that way. I think, I mean, I don't think I had that experience, but I could see that.
Well, for me, if that is the case, then it would probably help even more with self-discovery and self-growth because you have this sheet of paper in front of you with the things that possibly only subconsciously see as problems with yourself. Maybe I could be wrong about people like projecting onto that, but it reminds me of this exercise we did in AP psychology all the way back in high school, where the teacher of the class gave us a situation. It was something like two kids are on a date and the girl leaves to go get a soda. But they're like in a movie theater and she goes to go get a soda like in the middle of the movie. And then she asked the class, she basically went one by one and asked us each, why did she leave? And we all came up with these different answers for why she left. There was simple stuff like she was thirsty, and then there's other stuff like, I don't know, the dude smelled really bad and she needed to just get away from him. But the point of the exercise was to show that all we're really doing is projecting our own experiences and thoughts onto the situation. We're not really reading anything from it at all. And so that exercise that you talk about kind of reminds me of that.
Right, so you think that AP Psych girl getting a soda example, like the person who said that because the guy smells bad, do you think that's because like that's a projection of like him being maybe insecure about himself and how he smells?
Maybe, yeah, something like that.
Okay, it's
Let's
interesting.
think of another example could be like, oh, the date's just really bad, so she's actually just bailing. Like that would probably come from someone who's had a similar experience.
I can see that. You don't just randomly think of that thought, so.
Yeah. So obviously my answer was something like, he was insanely hot, so she had to just she couldn't take it anymore. She needed a quick rest from being around him too long.
Can't say I disagree, man.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty positive note to go into our takeaways on. So I'll let you go first.
So my takeaway for this episode is I think firstly we need to establish that we have a duty to ourselves in terms of discovering and introspecting, and there's multiple ways to go about this. I think the simplest way is to really just live life, like actually like go outside and do stuff. That sounds like really general, but like there's really no other way to find yourself if you don't go out and like try stuff, like try anything, try new hobbies, try new interests, whatever that may be. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. I think that's the main first part of your life, and I think after that is pretty much up to whatever your life goals are. So if you want to start a family, if you want to have kids, I think that's obviously go for it. And I think what can lead to that part is just like setting up yourself for success, so that when you do become a parent one day, or when you do have kids, you can also set them up for success, and hopefully that becomes like a domino effect in that kind of way.
Yeah, that's a nice thought. What I would say the takeaway for this episode is that responsibility comes on the back of understanding, and I would say that you could view those three levels of responsibilities sort of like concentric circles, where the innermost circle is self and the outermost circle is society. And you need a foundation from within in order to effectively operate on further and further out levels. You can't start from the outside and work your way inside. You're just going to fall into the middle, like a black hole, perhaps. And so I think the first step for everyone in order to make a positive impact on the world is to make a positive impact on themselves, even if it's really small stuff. Something that Jordan Peterson says a lot is to clean your damn room. And for a while, I thought that was pretty dumb, but more and more recently, I've come to realize the weight of such a statement and how important it really is. If you can't clean your room, I don't know how you're going to be able to take care of a kid. I think that's really what it comes down to. It's not that your room being clean is a necessary thing. I mean, who gives a shit if your room is clean? But if you can't even clean your room, how are you supposed to do anything else? So if you really want to make the world a better place in some way, start from within and then work outward, not vice versa.
Absolutely. And I think, people say put yourself first is a selfish statement, but I think it's actually like bizarrely, it might be the opposite actually, if you really think about it.
Very well could be. I think honestly, a lot of the time that people are perceiving themselves as what they're doing is like putting other people ahead of them are actually not on purpose, but in some sense being selfish because they're not actually helping those people. If you're not capable of helping, then in all likelihood, what you're doing is hurting. And I'm not saying that you're like a bad person for doing that. It's just that your methodology is perhaps flawed.
Yep. Well, I think that's a good
All
way
right.
to wrap it up.
I agree. Okay, so for Jue and Tyler, this has been Collective Conscious, episode 12. Thanks for listening.